I was sitting alone in my cabin, the scent of pine wood and old books hanging in the air, when the old man knocked. His presence was unexpected. No one came this deep into the woods unless they had nowhere else to go. "Come in," I called, and the door creaked open. He stepped inside, slow but steady. His face was a road map of wrinkles, his eyes pale blue and distant, like they had seen something on the horizon that I couldn't. He closed the door behind him, took off his hat, and held it against his chest. "I need a session," he said. "Cabin therapy, right? That's what you do." I nodded. I wasn't a licensed therapist, but people who found their way to my door usually didn't care about credentials. They just needed to talk, and I was good at listening. He lowered himself into the chair across from me, sighing as if the act of sitting down carried a weight far heavier than his body. "I have 5 days left," he said. No hesitation. No lead-in. Just the plain, unshaken truth. I watched him, waiting for him to explain. "The doctor told me last week," he continued. "Cancer. Nothing to be done. 5 days, maybe less." I had seen a lot of sorrow in this cabin, grief, regret, loneliness. But this was different. This was time itself, staring at him like an old acquaintance, nodding in acknowledgement. "What do you want to talk about?" I asked. He chuckled. "I don't know. What do men talk about when they know they're running out of days?" He shook his head, rubbing his withered hands together. "I came here because I didn't want to spend my last moments alone, but I don't know what to do with them either." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "What's the first memory that comes to mind?" He blinked, surprised, then let out a breath. "The ocean," he said. "I grew up by the sea. My father used to take me on his fishing boat before sunrise. I remember the way the morning light made the water look like gold." He smiled, lost in it for a moment. "I haven't seen the ocean in years." "Why not?" "Life got in the way. Work, marriage, kids. Then they grew up, and my wife passed. I just never went back." I studied him. "Would you go, if you could?" He let the question sit between us, rolling it over in his mind. Then he nodded. "Yeah, I think I would." I stood up and grabbed my coat. "Then let's go." His brows lifted. "What?" "You have 5 days. That's enough time to see the ocean again." He laughed, but there was something behind it. Hope, maybe. "You serious?" I opened the door, letting in the crisp evening air. "Why not?" For the first time since he walked in, he looked alive. "Hell," he muttered, standing up. "Let's do it." And just like that, the cabin therapy session was over. The real work, the real living, had just begun. I grabbed my coat, but for a moment, I hesitated. Not because I doubted what we were about to do, but because, deep down, I knew this wasn't just for him. The truth was, I'd built this cabin therapy idea on a lie, on the illusion that I was the guide, the listener, the one helping others find their way. But the ones who showed up at my door weren't the only lost souls in these woods. I had been running too. It wasn't sickness that had put me here, but something just as consuming. Regret. Guilt. The kind of weight you carry in your bones long after the world has stopped demanding you answer for it. Once, I had a life beyond these trees. A career, a love, a future mapped out in careful detail. And then, I made a choice. The wrong one. I hurt someone I had promised never to hurt. And instead of fixing it, instead of facing it, I ran. This cabin was supposed to be a place of solitude, a retreat from the noise of my mistakes. But solitude turns into exile faster than you think. And after enough time, you start to forget whether you chose it or it chose you. I looked at the old man, his eyes still alight with that flicker of hope. He was a man with 5 days left, and he wanted to use them. He wasn't retreating. He wasn't hiding. He was stepping forward into what little time remained. Could I say the same? Maybe that's why I stood up. Maybe that's why I opened the door. Maybe that's why, even as the cold air rushed in, I found myself breathing easier than I had in years. Because I had spent so long listening to other people's stories, I had forgotten I still had one of my own. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start living it again. We walked to my truck in silence, the crunch of leaves beneath our boots the only sound between us. The night air smelled of pine and damp earth, and I could feel the weight of what we were about to do settling between us. Not fear, not regret, but something heavier, the weight of unspoken things. As I started the engine, I glanced at him. "Tell me more about the ocean." He smiled, but it was a tired smile, the kind that carried years. "It's the only place I ever felt small in a way that didn't scare me." I let that sit for a moment before I asked, "Why did you leave?" He exhaled, long and slow. "My father was a fisherman, just like his father before him. It was the only life I ever knew. But I wanted more." He rubbed his hands together, as if warming them against a memory that had long gone cold. "I left for college, first in my family to go. Study business. My father didn't understand it. He used to say, 'What's the point of learning how to count money if you don't know how to make it?' He chuckled, shaking his head. I guess he was half right. I waited. He had more to say. I could feel it. I got a job. Worked in an office. Made more money in a year than my father did in 5. But the thing about leaving is that the place you left behind doesn't stay frozen. It keeps moving, changing, and one day you wake up and realize you don't know how to go back. Did you ever try?" He swallowed hard. "Once. After my father passed." His fingers tightened around the hat in his lap. I stood on the docks, looking out at the boats, at the water. It smelled the same, sounded the same, but I wasn't the same. I thought about getting on a boat, just to feel it again. But I didn't. I turned around and left. "Why?" He let out a breath. "Because I had spent too much time pretending I didn't miss it. And when you do that long enough, you start to believe it." We drove for a while in silence. The road stretched ahead of us, endless and dark, but the old man looked different now, lighter, maybe. As if saying the words had loosened something that had been knotted up inside him for years. "Do you regret leaving?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out the window, watching the trees blur past. "No," he said finally. "But I regret not going back sooner." I nodded, understanding more than I let on. Maybe this trip wasn't just about seeing the ocean again. Maybe it was about making peace with the years between. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. The truck rumbled down the dirt road, headlights cutting through the thick dark of the forest. The old man sat beside me, quiet, his hands resting on his lap, his hat still clutched between them. I kept my eyes on the road, letting the silence stretch between us. Some people needed time to let their thoughts settle before they could shape them into words. And I had plenty of patience. Eventually, he spoke. I don't know why I said yes. I glanced at him. "To this trip?" He nodded, lips pressing into a thin line before he sighed. "I've spent years making peace with the life I lived. Or at least telling myself I had. But I think I was just waiting for something to happen. And then the doctor told me I was out of time, and I realized nothing ever happens unless you decide to make it happen." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Hell of a thing to learn at the end." I considered that. "You said you regret not going back sooner. When was the last time you really thought about the ocean?" His fingers tapped against his knee, slow and thoughtful. "A few weeks ago." "What happened a few weeks ago?" He exhaled, long and slow. "I had a dream." I stayed quiet, letting him take his time. I was on my father's boat. The way it used to be, before the rust, before the years wore it down. The deck was warm from the morning sun, and the ocean stretched out in every direction, endless and cold. I could hear the seagulls. Smell the salt. My father was there, younger than I ever remember him, standing at the bow with a cigarette between his fingers. He turned to me and said, "I thought you'd never come back." The old man let out a small, bitter laugh. And then I woke up. Just like that. "What do you think it meant?" I asked. He rubbed his hands together, as if trying to warm himself. I think it meant I never stopped missing it. No matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise. I let his words settle between us before asking, "Why did you try to convince yourself?" His jaw tightened. Because admitting I missed it meant admitting I'd wasted years staying away. He shook his head. And that's a hard truth to swallow. I didn't argue. Some regrets felt like they could crush a man under their weight. And some could. The road stretched on, winding through the trees, and after a while, I spoke again. "Tell me about your father." The old man smiled, but there was something distant in it. Like the memory of a sunrise you hadn't seen in a long time. He was a hard man. Not cruel, just firm. Stubborn as hell. He loved the sea more than anything. Used to say the ocean was the only thing in life that made sense, predictable in its unpredictability. He smirked. I never understood what he meant by that until I got older. I glanced at him. What do you think he would say if he saw you now? His fingers tightened around his hat. Depends on which part of me he was looking at. He let out breath. If he saw the man who left, he'd shake his head. Call me a fool for trading the tie for a desk. But if he saw the man sitting here, now? He stared out at the passing trees, voice quieter now. I think he'd be glad I finally found my way back. Silence settled over us again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful. We drove through the night, stopping only when exhaustion pressed in. We pulled off onto a quiet stretch of road near a gas station, reclining our seats, letting sleep take us. The next morning, I woke first, stretching the stiffness from my bones as the sky blushed pink with the coming dawn. The old man stood beside me, groaning as he rubbed his neck. Sleeping in a truck isn't as easy as it used to be, he muttered. I chuckled. Ever sleep on your boat? He smiled, eyes still half-lidded with sleep. Plenty of times. You get used to the rocking after a while. It becomes a lullaby. I let the image settle in my mind, the younger version of him, curled up in the bow of a fishing boat, the waves carrying him to sleep. After grabbing some gas station coffee and stretching our legs, we hit the road again. Somewhere along the way, as the trees thinned and the air grew lighter, he spoke again. I never told my wife how much I missed the ocean. I glanced at him. Why not? He sighed. Because I loved her. And our life together wasn't by the sea. She was a city girl, through and through. Tall buildings, streetlights, the hum of traffic, she thrived in it. And I loved her more than I missed the waves. He shook his head. But I wonder sometimes if she ever knew. If she ever saw it in my eyes, the way I looked toward the horizon like I was waiting for something. I thought about that. About the sacrifices we make for love, the quiet griefs we carry, unspoken and unseen. She must have loved you, too, I said. He smiled, soft and sad. She did. And I never regretted loving her. Not for a second. We drove on. The land flattened out, trees giving way to open roads and distant hills. The air smelled different here, warmer, salt-tinged. Not quite the ocean yet, but close. The old man seemed more awake now, more present. His hands didn't tremble as much. His eyes were clearer. At a diner off the highway, over eggs and black coffee, he asked me something unexpected. What about you? What brought you to that cabin? I hesitated. No one ever asked me that. Not really. Regret, I said finally. He studied me, waiting. I sighed. I made a mistake. Hurt someone I shouldn't have. And instead of facing it, I ran. Thought if I disappeared into the woods long enough, I could outrun it. He nodded, as if he understood. Maybe he did. And did it work? He asked. I met his gaze. No. A small smile touched his lips. Then maybe it's time you stop running. I let out breath. Maybe he was right. By the time we reached the ocean, the old man was silent. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he didn't need to say anything. The waves stretched out before us, endless and golden under the afternoon sun. The air was thick with salt, the scent of it filling our lungs. He stepped forward, slipping off his shoes, letting the tide wash over his feet. For a long time, he just stood there, staring out at the horizon, the way he had in his dream. And then, finally, he smiled. A real, deep, unparted smile. "Feels like coming home," he murmured. I watched him, knowing he had found something here. Something that had been waiting for him all along. And maybe, just maybe, I had found something, too. The waves lapped at his feet, pulling back, rolling forward again. A steady rhythm. A heartbeat as old as the world. The old man stood there, still as the worn driftwood scattered along the shore, staring out at the endless horizon. I didn't say anything. Some moments weren't meant to be interrupted. After a long while, he let out a slow breath. I almost forgot what it felt like. I stepped beside him, feeling the wet sand shift beneath my feet. "But you didn't." He nodded, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. "No, I didn't." The tide curled in again, swirling around his ankles. His old hands trembled at his sides, not with fear, not with sickness, but with something else. Something lighter. "I should have done this sooner," he murmured. "But you're here now," I said. He turned his head slightly, studying me. "Yeah," he said. "I am." For a while, we just stood there. The waves came and went, the sun dipped toward the horizon, and the sky burned gold and pink. Then, finally, he moved. Slowly, carefully, he took off his jacket and folded it over his arm. Rolled up his pant legs. Took another step forward. The water climbed higher up his shins, cool and relentless. He let out a quiet laugh. "My father used to say the ocean doesn't give a damn who you are," he said. "Rich man, poor man, young, old. It treats everyone the same." I watched him as he kept moving forward. What else did he say? That if you give yourself to it, really give yourself to it, it'll carry you. The old man stood there, knee-deep now, his hands loose at his sides. His eyes were clearer than they'd been since the day he walked into my cabin. He turned back to me, smiling. "Guess we'll see if the old bastard was right." Then he let himself fall. For a split second, I panicked. His body hit the water with a soft splash, swallowed by the tide. But then he surfaced, laughing. A deep, full-bodied sound, carried by the wind. His arms spread wide, floating. I waded in after him, the water biting against my legs, until I stood close enough to hear him whisper, "God, I miss this." I let him have his moment. Let him drift, let him feel the weight of the years wash away, let him remember who he was before time and regret and life got in the way. When he was ready, I helped him back to shore. We sat on the sand, soaked to the bone, watching the sun sink into the sea. "What now?" I asked. He smiled, wringing salt water from his sleeves. "Now," he let out a breath. "Now, I think I can go." I swallowed, nodding. Neither of us had to say what we both knew. Time had never really been on his side. The 5 days were always borrowed. But in the end, they had been enough. "I don't want to die in some hospital," he said. Hooked up to machines, waiting for my body to give up. I looked at him. "Then don't." His brow furrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" I gestured back up the shore. "Come back with me. To the cabin. Spend your last days in a place that's quiet, where the air smells like pine, where you can hear the wind in the trees. We'll build a fire. You can tell me more about your father's boat. About your wife. About all the things you thought you'd never say out loud." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he whispered. "I'd like that." The last days were peaceful. The old man spent most of his time sitting by the window, watching the trees sway. Some nights, we sat by the fire, talking about everything and nothing at all. He told me about the first time he fell in love. About the time he and his best friend stole a neighbor's rowboat and nearly got lost at sea. about the way his wife used to hum under her breath when she cooked. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he asked me for a favor. When it's time, he said, I don't want it to happen in bed. I want to be outside. I met his gaze. Nodded. Okay. 2 nights later, I woke to find him sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket. It's time, he said. I didn't argue. Didn't ask if he was sure. I helped him outside to a chair facing the forest. The air smelled like damp earth and pine. A light breeze rustled the trees, whispering through the leaves. He took a slow, deep breath. Feels good, he murmured. Then, after a long pause, thank you. I didn't speak. Just sat beside him, listening to the sounds of the woods. At some point, he stopped breathing. The wind kept moving. The trees kept swaying. The world didn't stop, but for a moment, I did. After a while, I stood, draped the blanket over his shoulders one last time. Then I sat back down, watching the stars blink into existence above the treetops. Somewhere, beyond the pines, beyond the land itself, the ocean was still moving. And I liked to think it carried him with it.